You know that moment when the world goes quiet, when the lights are off, your phone finally stops buzzing, and it's just you, wide awake, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. That's the hour when truth no longer hides behind pride. That's when the avoidant, who thought they didn't need anyone, finally feels the weight of what they've lost. They told themselves they needed space, they convinced themselves love was suffocating, and they ran because distance felt safer than vulnerability. But tonight at 2 a.m., that distance feels like an endless desert. See, when an avoidant loses a super empath, they don't lose just a person, they lose the mirror that reflected their best self. The super empath loved with a kind of gentleness that asked for nothing but connection. They offered understanding instead of arguments, patience instead of pressure, and consistency instead of chaos. The avoidant didn't know how rare that was until the silence became deafening. They didn't realize how much they relied on that calm energy to steady their inner storm. And now, every unanswered message and every memory of laughter feels like a ghost that won't stop whispering. You pushed away the one who actually saw you. At 2 a.m., the avoidant's armor cracks. They replay the last conversation, the one where they shut down instead of opening up, where they said, "I'm fine," when they were breaking inside. They think about how the super empath always reached out first, always tried to understand, always believed there was still something worth saving. But that kind of love burns out eventually because you can't keep pouring into someone who's terrified to receive. And so the empath walks away quietly, gracefully, while the avoidant watches from behind their walls, pretending it doesn't hurt. But now, with no one left to blame, the avoidant faces the truth they've been running from. The fear wasn't of love, it was of being truly seen. Because being loved by an empath means being known in your rawest form, your flaws, your fears, your silence, your contradictions. It's the kind of love that asks you to show up as you are, and that's terrifying for someone who's built an identity around not needing anyone. Yet, when it's gone, they finally understand that kind of love doesn't come twice. So at 2 a.m., they scroll through old photos they hover over, typing, but never send the message. They listen to songs that make them ache, trying to decode feelings they never allowed themselves to feel before. They think they're missing the person, but what they're really missing is the version of themselves that felt safe enough to be soft. That version existed only in the presence of the empath, the one they pushed away. And maybe they'll reach out one day, months later, trying to rekindle what they thought they could easily replace. But by then, the super empath will have learned to love themselves the way they once loved the avoidant, with tenderness, with care, and with boundaries. And that's the real heartbreak, realizing you only learned the value of connection after it was gone. Because at 2 a.m., when the silence speaks louder than your ego, even the strongest walls start to crumble. And that's when the avoidant finally whispers to themselves, "I should have stayed." Avoidants often mistake distance for safety. They believe that if they can just keep people at arm's length, they won't get hurt. The logic seems simple. If you don't get too close, you can't be abandoned. If you don't open up, no one can use your vulnerability against you. So they build walls, not because they don't crave love, but because they crave control. They tell themselves that love equals danger, that needing someone is weakness, and that solitude is strength. But what they don't realize is that the very walls they build to keep pain out also keep love from getting in. They become prisoners of their own defense system, confusing silence for peace and emotional numbness for stability. In relationships, avoidants often seem calm, detached, and even self-sufficient. They appear unbothered when things go wrong, almost unaffected when someone walks away. But beneath that composure is a storm they can't admit exists. Their detachment isn't indifference, it's survival. They learn somewhere along the way that love can wound, that closeness can overwhelm, and that trusting someone is a gamble that often ends in loss. So they retreat, convincing themselves that solitude is a form of self-preservation. Yet it's at night, when the world is quiet, that the illusion starts to fall apart. Because when no one is watching and there's no one left to perform for, the emptiness begins to echo louder than ever. At 2 a.m., the avoidant realizes that space doesn't heal what avoidance hides. The silence they once craved starts to feel suffocating. The peace they thought they had created starts to feel like exile. They scroll through old messages, stare at photos, and wonder how something that felt so overwhelming could now feel so far away. It's not that they stop caring, it's that caring now hurts more than they can bear to admit. The person who once made them feel seen, understood, and loved has walked away, and for the first time, there's no one left to blame but themselves. Avoidants often believe that their calm and distance protect them from chaos, but emotional distance doesn't stop pain, it only delays it. Every time they withdraw instead of speaking, every time they choose silence instead of vulnerability, they trade temporary comfort for long-term loneliness. And it's in the stillness of the night, when pride loses its power, that they start to see the cost of their choices. They realize that the safety they fought so hard to maintain has become a cage. The walls that once made them feel secure now separate them from the very connection they secretly long for. What they come to understand, often too late, is that love was never the threat. The real threat was their fear of being seen. Avoidants aren't cold people, they are wounded people who learned that hiding was easier than healing. And yet, the irony is that healing can only happen through closeness, the very thing they keep running from. At 2 a.m., that truth hits hardest. Because in the quiet, with no one left to hold or push away, they face the one thing they've avoided all along: themselves. The super empath is the kind of person who loves with quiet strength. They don't love to control, to fix, or to fill an empty space. They love because it's their nature to do so. Their empathy allows them to see beyond a person's defenses, beyond the harsh words or cold silences, into the pain and fear that lie underneath. When they meet an avoidant, they sense the guardedness immediately. They can feel the push and pull, the emotional distance, the constant battle between wanting connection and fearing it. Yet, instead of running, they stay. They try to love patiently, softly, hoping their consistency will prove that love doesn't have to hurt. The super empath's quiet power lies in their ability to remain calm in emotional chaos. They are the anchor in the storm, the steady hand when everything else feels unpredictable. Their compassion isn't weakness, it's their superpower. They can hold space for someone else's fear without making it their own. But the painful truth is that this gift often becomes a burden when they fall in love with someone who can't receive it. The avoidant's inability to let love in turns the empath's nurturing energy into exhaustion. The more the empath gives, the less they receive. They begin to question themselves. Am I too much, too emotional, too demanding? They start dimming their light to fit inside the avoidant's shadows, not realizing that love isn't meant to shrink them. Over time, the empath begins to feel the weight of one-sided emotional labor. They sense the distance growing but keep hoping it's temporary. They interpret silence as overwhelm rather than rejection, and they forgive absences that cut deeply because they understand pain so well. Their compassion keeps them loyal. Even when their heart is breaking, they believe that if they just love a little harder, stay a little longer, the avoidant will finally see how safe it is to open up. But what the empath doesn't realize is that their endless understanding often gives the avoidant permission to keep running. Because when someone never sets boundaries, the other person never has to face their own growth. Eventually, something shifts. The super empath reaches a point where their empathy becomes self-destructive. They wake up one day realizing they've been loving someone at the cost of themselves. They see how they've been holding space for a person who never met them halfway, and suddenly, the silence that once scared them feels like peace. This is when the empath's quiet power transforms from patience into self-respect. They stop trying to fix, stop explaining, stop waiting. They start redirecting all that love inward, learning that their sensitivity is not a flaw, but a gift that deserves to be honored. When they finally walk away, it's not with anger or bitterness. It's with clarity. They don't need to prove their worth to someone who couldn't see it. They understand now that love cannot flourish where fear dictates the rhythm, and though the avoidant may one day wake up and realize what they've lost, the empath will no longer be waiting, because the person who once gave all their love to others has finally learned to give it to themselves. There's something about the night that has a way of stripping us bare. When everything slows down, when the noise fades and the distractions disappear, that's when the truth finally finds its way through the cracks. For an avoidant, 2 a.m. is not just another hour, it's the reckoning. It's the moment when their defenses begin to crumble, when the calm fight they wear during the day can no longer hold the weight of what's inside. During the day, they can pretend to be fine. They can keep busy, distract themselves with work, friends, or meaningless conversations. But at 2 a.m., when they're alone with their thoughts, there's nowhere left to run. The silence becomes loud, the emptiness feels heavier, and the face of the person they pushed away starts to appear in every corner of their memory. The avoidant often tells themselves they don't need anyone. They convince themselves that detachment is strength, that love complicates life, and that independence is the ultimate freedom. But when they lose someone who loved them purely, someone who saw their pain and stayed, the silence starts to haunt them. At 2 a.m., they begin to feel the ache of absence, a kind of emotional gravity that pulls them into reflection. They replay the moments when the super empath reached out, when they could have chosen honesty instead of withdrawal, softness instead of silence. They remember the gentle eyes that looked at them with understanding, the the touch that didn't demand but offered warmth. They remember how they felt seen, maybe for the first time in their life, and how terrifying that was. In that quiet hour, pride doesn't mean much anymore. The walls that once made them feel powerful now feel like a prison. The avoidant starts to feel the consequences of their distance. They realize that space which once felt safe has now turned into isolation. The text messages left unanswered, of the calls they ignored, the moments they shut down, they all echo back now as regret, because love, once lost, doesn't fade easily, especially when it came from someone who loved without agenda, who didn't demand perfection, only connection. The 2 a.m. awakening isn't about missing the person in a surface level way. It's about confronting the truth that they didn't lose just someone who cared. They lost a part of themselves that only came alive in that connection. The super empath's love gave them permission to feel, to hope, to believe they were worthy of being known. And now, without that presence, they feel empty in a way that distractions can't fill. They scroll through pictures, hover over messages they'll never send, and wonder how someone who once felt like too much now feels like the only thing missing. In that hour of honesty, they begin to understand that love was never the enemy. Vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was the bridge to everything they actually wanted but couldn't admit. The avoidant realizes that their walls didn't protect them from pain, they protected them from love. And now, in the stillness of 2 a.m., they're left with a truth that hits harder than heartbreak. It wasn't that the empath couldn't love them enough. It was that they never let themselves be loved at all. Regret has a way of arriving quietly, often disguised as reflection. For the avoidant, it doesn't crash in all at once. It seeps in slowly, creeping through the cracks of their composure long after the relationship has ended. They replay the conversations they avoided, the moments when the super empath reached out with love and they met it with indifference. They remember the times they chose silence over honesty, detachment over vulnerability, and pride over connection. In the moment, withdrawing felt like control. It felt safe, even righteous. But as time passes, those choices begin to feel like ghosts that won't leave them alone. Every memory becomes a reminder of what they didn't say, of the tenderness they withheld, of the love they were too afraid to return. Avoidants often believe that their calm and stoic demeanor keeps them strong. They think being unreadable shields them from emotional chaos. But what they don't realize is that every time they hold back their truth, they create a void between themselves and the person who's trying to love them. The super empath can feel that void even if they can't name it. They sense when words are unsaid, when emotions are being swallowed, when walls are silently rising. And while the empath keeps trying, offering patience, reassurance, and gentle invitations to open up, the avoidant keeps retreating into the comfort of solitude until one day the empath stops trying. And that's when the silence turns from peaceful to painful. When the empath walks away, the avoidant tells themselves they're fine. They may even feel relief at first, convincing themselves they needed space, that love was too heavy, that detachment is freedom. But that illusion never lasts, because love leaves an imprint, and the kind that the empath gives doesn't fade easily. Weeks later, months later, maybe years later, the avoidant finds themselves haunted by the weight of their own unspoken words. They start to feel the ache of what they never expressed, the "I love you" they never said, the apology that remained locked inside, the late night thoughts they dismissed instead of sharing, all the moments they could have chosen connection but didn't. At 2 a.m., those memories come back sharp and vivid, the warmth of the empath's laughter, of the look in their eyes when they tried to understand, the quiet strength in the way they loved without expectation. The avoidant starts to see what they were too blind to appreciate before, that love doesn't demand perfection, it simply asks for presence. But presence requires courage, and courage is what they lacked when it mattered most. They thought love was about control but now they see it was about surrender, the willingness to be seen even when you don't feel worthy. And so the regret deepens, because they realize it wasn't just the empath's love they lost, but the chance to show up as their truest self. All the things they wanted to say, but didn't now live in the silence between them, a silence that grows heavier with time. And maybe the most painful part isn't that the empath is gone, it's knowing they had every opportunity to stay connected, to be honest, to be real, and they let it slip away. In the end, the unspoken becomes the loudest truth of all, echoing in every quiet moment where they once could have chosen love but chose fear instead. There comes a point when the super empath, after all the effort, patience, and hope, finally reaches a quiet realization. They can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. They've spent so long trying to hold together something that was never balanced, pouring their love into a space that gave little back. They've waded through silence, excused distance, and convinced themselves that understanding someone's pain was enough reason to tolerate the lack of reciprocity. But over time, even the kindest heart gets tired. The super empath begins to see that love without mutual effort isn't compassion, it's self-abandonment. And when they finally decide to walk away, it's not from a place of anger or resentment, but from deep acceptance. They understand that they cannot heal in the same space that hurt them. When the empath steps back, everything changes. The dynamic that once defined the relationship begins to collapse. The avoidant, who always believed the empath would stay no matter what, starts to feel the shift. The texts that once arrived like clockwork stop coming. The patience that once absorbed every withdrawal is no longer there. The energy that once flowed toward them now turns inward as the empath begins to pour that same care into their own healing. This is the irreversible shift, the moment when the empath reclaims their power. What once looked like infinite tolerance is replaced by quiet boundaries. What once felt like longing turns into clarity, and the avoidant, who once took comfort in their distance, suddenly feels the loss in full force. The empath's growth after heartbreak is profound. They learn to love themselves the way they used to love others, fully, deeply, without conditions. They realize that their empathy is not meant to be spent on fixing people who fear closeness, but on nurturing their own peace. They begin to find beauty in solitude, strength in boundaries, and dignity in letting go. What once felt like emptiness transforms into space for self-discovery, new connections, and a gentler kind of love that doesn't demand their constant proving. The pain doesn't disappear overnight, but it evolves. What was once heartbreak becomes wisdom. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins to feel the consequences of their choices. They look back and see how much the empath gave, how patient and forgiving they were, and how much of themselves they lost trying to love someone who kept pushing them away. They start to realize that the empath didn't just leave, they outgrew the cycle, and that realization cuts deep because while the empath is healing and transforming, the avoidant remains trapped in the very patterns that drove them apart. The empath's departure marks the end of one story and the beginning of another. They no longer see love as something to chase or earn, but something that should meet them halfway. The lessons are hard, but they're freeing. They've learned that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and that walking away doesn't mean giving up. It means finally choosing themselves. So while the avoidant might someday return, full of apologies and nostalgia, the empath they once knew won't be there waiting. That version of them, the one who overgave, who tolerated too much, who mistook pain for passion, no longer exists. They've evolved into someone stronger, wiser, and finally at peace with letting go. In the end, this story isn't about blame, it's about awakening. It's about understanding that love cannot thrive behind walls, and that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the courage that builds connection. The avoidant learns too late that running from love only leads them back to loneliness, while the super empath discovers that their softness was never the problem, giving it to the wrong person was. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us, of to love bravely, to communicate honestly, and to never lose ourselves trying to hold on to someone afraid of being held. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for allowing these words to remind you that real love begins where fear ends.